In 2016, the City of Portland passed a groundbreaking ordinance banning new fossil fuel infrastructure. But about a year later, a Houston-based oil company called Zenith Energy was able to sneak into town by purchasing a facility along with its permits that had previously handled oil and asphalt. They started accepting 100-car-long trains carrying crude oil from Canada and North Dakota, storing it in tanks along the river, and then putting it on ships, which would travel to Asia or to refineries along the West Coast. Now, in order to keep operating, Zenith needed to get a permit from the Department of Environmental Quality, and in order to get that permit, they needed an agreement from the city. Initially, because of pressure from the community and from politicians around the state, the city declined to give this agreement to Zenith, but then, in a backroom deal, they said Zenith could keep handling crude as long as they transitioned in 5 years to renewable diesel. Wait a minute, we said, what is renewable diesel?
We need to drastically reduce our carbon emissions in order to stave off the worst impacts of climate chaos. And we need to be doing this now. But as more and more truly carbon-free technologies come on board, a whole array of questionable alternatives, such as biofuels, carbon offsets, and carbon capture and storage, are proliferating.
There is no such thing as renewable diesel.
Basav Sen is the Climate Policy Director at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C.
They are going to synthesize diesel from plant matter. That process itself is water intensive and polluting, and then they end up with diesel.
The real reason I think that renewable diesel is a very popular idea with oil companies.
Ann Alexander was a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council in San Francisco and is now with Devonshire Strategies in San Carlos, California.
They can use their existing infrastructure to produce a product that can be used in the same manner as their existing product.
You don't have to have a different kind of engine.
Melanie Plout is with Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility.
Like with biodiesel, it's dirtier. You can only put about 20% in to mix with the fossil diesel. But renewable diesel is quite highly refined, and it can be put into your truck exactly as the same as fossil diesel.
The term renewable, just like the term sustainable, can be very misleading.
Richard Plevin is a consultant doing research and modeling related to climate effects on biofuels.
People think of it as a signifier of something that's good for the environment, but in fact it's just sort of a label that distinguishes it from petroleum diesel. You can be renewable in that you can grow a soy crop every year and make fuel out of it, but it might be the case that you're emitting more greenhouse gas emissions in that whole process than if you had just used petroleum-based diesel.
The claim that this is carbon neutral is that plants grow and they pull carbon from the air. Then you burn them and you put that carbon back into the air, but then more plants grow taking their place, pulling more carbon from the air. If you're burning plant matter, you're releasing a whole lot of carbon into the air right away. That will only slowly get absorbed back into plant matter.
In a lot of cases, these products are chemically identical to fossil fuels.
Kate Murphy is a senior community organizer with Columbia Riverkeeper.
And so you have a lot of the same risks when it comes to accidents, spills, exposure, emissions, harms to aquatic life and the environment. But it's being done under the guise of climate progress. There's so many unknowns still about these renewables that we haven't answered yet. And we have a situation where you're introducing new products and you're depending on old regulatory language to be protective.
When renewable diesel, and I feel the need to put that in air quotes, is promoted, there is often an undercurrent in the promotion that the types of feedstocks they are using are essentially things that would otherwise go to waste. The favorite feedstock that the companies doing these renewable diesel conversions like to point to is used cooking oil, the oil left over from frying the McDonald's French fries to produce energy. The problem is there are just not enough French fries in the world to produce the volume of renewable diesel that they're talking about producing in these major conversions. So what they're actually using are oils that are in the food crop system.
With fossil fuels, you drill into the ground, and we've seen some of the wastelands that's created in the boreal forests in Canada, which have just been stripped in this incredibly destructive way.
Ben Eichenberg is a staff attorney with San Francisco Baykeeper.
Well, we're doing the same things for biofuels. We're going to forests in Indonesia, in a lot of tropical areas, and mowing them down and putting in monocultures for palm oil or for soybean oil.
Another dirty little secret of biofuels is that it diverts precious farmland from growing food to growing fuel, to fuel our increasingly energy-intensive lifestyle. That's very dangerous to begin with, and it's even more dangerous when we are looking at a future of potential food scarcity because of climate change.
These companies are extraordinarily cagey about what feedstock oils they're going to be using because they're not sure. Soybean oil is far and away the most likely candidate for what is going to dominate. We determined that if the Phillips 66 refinery were to use only soybean oil as a feedstock, they would consume nearly 40% of the entire U.S. supply of soybean oil.
2 years before renewable diesel became a concern in Portland, 2 Bay Area refineries, Phillips 66 in Rodeo and Marathon Martinez, began converting to renewable diesel.
These 2 massive refineries in the Bay Area are saying, we're just going to create a huge market for these oils. Well, what do you think is going to happen? The price is going to go up. They say they're not going to use any more than has already been produced, and they're only going to buy it from U.S. farms. That doesn't change the global economy. The global economy says when the price in the United States for soybean oil goes up, then the price also goes up in Indonesia, and they're just going to cut down more forests because that's the way to make money.
A lot of these food crop oils are fungible. You can use them all for the same purpose. If you're a cookie baking company, you can use soybean oil, but if soybean oil gets too expensive, you can go switch to other types of oils. One of the other types of oils these manufacturers can switch to is palm oil. To grow palm oil requires massive deforestation in parts of the world that can least afford it, where endangered species such as orangutans and others are depending on these forests. It has led to both environmental abuses and human rights abuses to grow it. And palm oil has a massive carbon impact in its growth, in part because of the deforestation. The renewable diesel producers, in large part, have committed not to use palm oil in their production. But it means nothing if then they use enough soybean oil that it disrupts the market to the point that palm oil replaces it. Their pledge hasn't really accomplished anything.
Phillips 66 started really beating the drum with just an amazingly competent public relations campaign a year before activists even caught wind of what this conversion from petroleum to so-called renewable diesel refining was going to look like.
Shoshana Wexler is an organizer with the Sunflower Alliance in the San Francisco Bay Area.
It wasn't as toxic. The emissions from coming out the back end of a truck were much more benign.
You can argue that gallon for gallon, there are somewhat lower pollution impacts to the renewable diesel. The question then becomes whether you swallow up that difference with the fact that you need to actually burn a little bit more renewable diesel to get the same energy output.
Huge amounts of fossil gas will be used to refine renewable diesel. So these claims that this renewable diesel is cleaner and greener and have so many benefits, entities that are absolutely going to benefit are the refiners that get to double down for another 30 to 40 years while they continue to refine stuff that we burn.
One of the significant and most dangerous components in refining both fossil and biodiesel is hydrogen, which is used to break down large hydrocarbons into smaller, more useful ones, a process called cracking. Maureen Brennan is a retired clinical lab scientist who lives in Rodeo, California, not far from the Phillips 66 refinery.
Phillips 66, they have 2 hydrogen plants.
There's one that is owned by Phillips 66. There's a second independent organization called Air Liquide. They are notorious since their inception in 2009 for causing huge flares. And the hydrogen plants are particularly prone to explosion.
These environmental justice communities who are right next to those refineries, they're being told there's going to be a little improvement in your quality of life because now we're going to be making biodiesel instead of regular diesel. But what are the actual impacts on the communities going to be compared with a baseline of not the community that suffered under these fossil fuel companies, under these refineries, but a healthy community where people have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink.
Renewable diesel will decrease our particulate matter emissions by 50%. But when you pump out 400,000 tons per year of particulate matter, cutting that in half, we still get to have 200,000 tons per year. That's not going to change our health statistics very much. Oh, the sulfur is going to go down by 70%. We're happy about that. However, there's other things that are going to go up. Nitrogen oxide, ammonia emissions. The hydrogen plant is going to be working overtime. So there's other emissions that are going to come to us that are worse than they were before.
You know, in Martinez, they had spent catalyst emissions coming out of the smokestacks in the refinery there that got sprinkled all over people's houses, cars, yards. The emergency management district for the county issued a warning to people, don't eat the food that you grow in your own garden because we don't know what this spent catalyst might have done to the soil. I would definitely test my soil if I lived near one of these places, and the people who live near them don't always have the means to do that kind of testing or to choose where they're going to live.
In upper New York State, in areas where there has been recently a lot of biorefining going on, there has been a tenfold increase in the number of children having asthma attacks. And this worries us very much here, that we don't know yet what the impacts will be until we're suffering them around Marathon, around Phillips 66. We've shared this area with the refinery since 1898. The refinery at that time encouraged people to move here. They built schools, they built churches, they built everything because they needed a workforce. People often ask me, well, if it's so polluted, why did you move there? Economics, pure and simple. I can't afford other places in the Bay Area. But I love this little town. It's hilly, it's green in the springtime, beautiful wildflowers. But there's this behemoth industry that has dominated this town for 100 years.
Renewable diesel is characterized as being so benign.
Gary Hughes is the Americas Program Coordinator for the international organization Biofuel Watch. He lives in Berkeley, California.
But there's really not been any sort of effort to try to estimate what would happen if there were to be a major renewable diesel fuel spill in the Bay. All we're confronting really is this ongoing narrative about how wonderful it is that we're moving on to this low carbon.
We had a spill in San Francisco Bay of what we called a mystery goo over 10 years ago now. All of a sudden, we started getting reports at Baykeeper that people were finding these little gooey balls all over the beaches, and they were finding animals struggling with some of this oil. Nobody knew what it was. We reached out to the oil spill response agencies and we said, looks like there's oil in the bay. Are you going to clean it up? And they said, no, we've tested it and it's not petroleum based, so we're not going to do anything about it. It turns out it was soy-based oil that spilled. We still don't know where that oil came from, what was the accident that caused it.
Communities across the Bay Area call this the refinery corridor, and others call it the gas station of the Pacific.
Theo Lacane works on the climate team with the Center for Biological Diversity in Oakland, California, and organizes their California oil and gas campaigns.
Because there are at least 5 refineries. One of them has been here for over 100 years, the Chevron refinery in Richmond. And so they are deeply embedded in these communities. Communities are dependent on the refineries, even though they know how harmful they are. And these refineries are very good at shaping hearts and minds. These ways that the industry has just embedded itself politically and culturally and economically, they make it really hard to disentangle it from people's lives.
To get a better idea of the environmental impacts of the 5 San Francisco Bay refineries, Ben Eichenberg with the San Francisco Baykeeper arranged a boat ride in the bay with several folks working to shut down the refineries. including Greg Karras, a principal at the Community Energy Resource.
We're at the mouth of the Carquinez Strait. It opens up into San Pablo Bay in front of us, and we're at Point Davis, right there where you see that marine terminal. That's the Phillips 66 refinery.
This is, to me, a very magical place because the Carquinez Straits flows into San Pablo Bay, which is part of the whole San Francisco Bay Area. And it also is a confluence with the Napa River, so all three waterways come together right here where we are.
People come to San Francisco and they say, I love San Francisco, I love to be able to get out in the woods, I can go sailing out on the bay and it's this beautiful place. And what people don't see or don't think about is the tremendous amount of industry that has always been here.
This is one of the two major crude oil to biofuel conversion projects in the Bay Area. This is to be the biggest in the world if it's built. And the other one, we'll see a little bit later, is just up the Carquinez Strait from us.
I brought you here to sort of see the refinery corridor, see just how much space it takes up, how much infrastructure is actually there. You can really see the pollution that comes out of it, and you see this infrastructure and you know that it's having a major impact on the communities nearby. I think if you're here on the water and you see what these plants look like, I think you get a real sense of why it's not okay to say, okay, well, we're just going to continue business as usual. Well, that's what got us into this problem in the first place.
At the scenic agricultural community of Port Westward, along the Columbia River in Oregon, another biodiesel refinery is proposed that would be one of the largest in the world.
Port Westward is the bend in the Columbia River estuary downstream from Portland.
Dan Sears is the advocacy director for Columbia Riverkeeper.
It's really in the heart of the Columbia River estuary, which is considered a linchpin for salmon restoration and recovery. It's a big area of 6,000 acres, some of which has been industrialized, but most of which remains agricultural. For over 2 decades, people in this area have been fighting the fossil fuel industry and winning. They've stood their ground against a liquefied natural gas terminal, multiple fracked gas pipelines, a methanol refinery, the expansion of oil train traffic, 2 coal terminals.
We are out near the Port Westward development site, near where the proposed rail site is for next renewable fuels.
Warren Seeley is a 4th-generation mint farmer in the Clatskanie, Oregon region.
What we're looking out over is an organic spearmint tea leaf field that I have. In the background we have some peppermint as well, and this is land that I've been farming for the last 20 years. You have a select group who's very adamant that the only way to develop out here is 1920 smokestacks, but I think most of the rest of the people there, they don't believe that.
Next is proposing the world's largest renewable diesel facility.
Brandon Schilling is a farmer in Clatskanie.
They would be producing 50,000 barrels of renewable diesel a day. They would be shipping in tons of seed oils to produce renewable diesel and shipping out all of the toxic byproducts. And meanwhile, we would have just rail yards and storage lots of rail cars full of toxic, flammable, contaminated materials right on the banks of the river.
Currently, we're looking out over spearmint and peppermint fields. We have trees on either side. When the clouds clear, you can see Mount St. Helens in the background. It's a really pretty view. If they get their facility built, we'll be looking out over pavement, rail, and flare towers, actually.
Folks started asking really pointed questions, like, what is this refinery going to emit? What will be the impacts on wetlands? What will be the impact on the river from a potential spill of all this liquid fuel? What would the impact be on the farms, the communities along the rail line, and ultimately the climate? Would it end up displacing fossil diesel, or would it just add more diesel to the market? And all of these questions ultimately led the community to become very, very opposed to the project because they couldn't get straight answers, and Next Renewables LLC over and over misled the community about the purpose and the impact of the project.
They don't even seem to know what they're going to build out here. I've heard everything from used cooking oil, where they've admitted they don't even have a collection structure for it. 1 walk at a time is how they're going to collect it. And then it became fish guts, and then it became animal tallow, and then it became, I think the latest was woody biomass. Renewable diesel will be the primary output. There will be some byproducts from that. I'm very concerned that this is going to end up as a disaster area.
The people who are for this project are people who stand to financially benefit. And the people who are against this project are basically everybody else. The people who want to keep their community livable, who want to keep their lifestyle as farmers, who believe in clean air and clean water, and understand that a lot of the promises from a greenwashed project like renewable diesel are false solutions.
They haven't been very consistent in what they're proposing, what their processes are. Nobody really seems to know what the actual design is. So safety is a huge concern. Taking this land out of agricultural production, that's a large concern as well.
Most people would concede that quote-unquote renewable energy needs to have some aspect of sane siting. It's just outstandingly stupid to take a refinery on this scale and plunk it down at a bend in the Columbia River estuary on soil that is totally unstable, prone to liquefaction, that in an earthquake will move feet up and down and sideways. How is all this equipment going to hold together? It's also not renewable if you're putting this huge fracked gas input into the fuel. Locking in 14.2 million cubic feet per day of fracked gas usage is a major problem for Oregon's climate goals and for the communities that experience that fracking. So there's something profoundly unsustainable about the project right there.
They're taking acreage that I farm. Part of this is organic spearmint tea leaf, which has a very good return for me, but it takes years to get replacement for that.
They don't know what their feedstock is. They don't know how it will arrive, but we know they intend for a good chunk of it to come by rail. That strongly suggests that you're going to be getting some type of purpose-grown crop coming from the middle of North America. So all of that fertilizer, all that water, training that material for hundreds of miles, it's very, very hard to imagine how you call this a renewable product.
Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality has released a draft environmental impact statement that would grant Next Energy a Clean Water Act permit. The draft statement would approve the proposed biofuel refinery, ignoring the issues being raised by the community opposing its development. According to Ben Eichenberg with San Francisco Baykeeper, regulators in California are also inclined to give the go-ahead for polluting industries.
A lot of the regulators rubber-stamped anything the refineries or heavy industry wanted to do, and they were able to sort of push it off on some of these communities and say, yeah, dump whatever you want, pollute however you want.
We have this revolving door between the industry and the regulatory agencies in so many cases. In California, until recently, the director of the State Oil and Gas Regulatory Agency had been an employee for Chevron. I mean, this is what happens when we allow the industry to have this much power, is that they regulate themselves through these agencies which they put their people in.
Elected officials love the political convenience of saying, oh, we can just capture the emissions and we can manage it that way, because they avoid the tough questions. They avoid having to really find the political will to take these economic interests on.
Marathon Martinez shut down during the pandemic because there wasn't enough supply. The only reason they're starting back up is because it's a biofuel conversion.
Ben Eichenberg, San Francisco Baykeeper.
The decision that Marathon made was to take advantage of the subsidies that California offers and that the federal government offers and convert to biofuels. So we need to figure out, how do we set up these economic incentives so that that's not the choice? Instead, how do we transition that land to something productive for the community that the community wants, that's going to create a healthy community and good, clean energy jobs that support that community? Are we going to do it now, when we have an oil industry that has a lot of money? Are we going to require them to put bonds in place for this cleanup? Or are we going to wait until they've declared bankruptcy and moved on?
The fossil fuel industry and big agricultural interests work very hard to find ways to market their dirty energy to the public.
Jim Walsh is the policy director at Food and Water Watch in Washington, D.C.
We see this with factory farm gas being called biogas.
There are a lot of different ways that methane can be produced. One of it is fossil methane from the earth.
Melanie Plowd, Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility.
But there are also biologic processes that produce methane, especially when something is degraded under anaerobic conditions. That means when there's no oxygen there. One of those situations occurs especially on large factory farms where there's a lot of manure that needs to be handled. You can cover it intentionally so that it produces methane, and then cleverly you can sell that methane.
What we're seeing now is a really intense and growing interest in developing what's called biogas, or what I call factory farm gas, in such enormous quantities at these facilities.
Tyler Lobdell is a staff attorney with Food and Water Watch in Boise, Idaho.
So they can't be managed responsibly or managed in the way that traditional agriculture always managed it.
The gas companies want to make you believe that we're going to replace all of this dirty fossil gas with methane gas from a farm. But the fact is that it's quite expensive to make that RNG. It's much more expensive, actually, than fossil gas, so it requires subsidies. It's still methane. When you burn it, it still produces carbon dioxide and it still leaks all along the supply chain and in your home. It's really not any better than fossil methane, and there's not nearly enough of it to ever make a big dent in how much fossil gas we're using.
Now we see Shell Oil, Chevron partnering with mega dairies, huge beef feedlots in Texas, to monetize all that pollution in so-called biogas. They'll take that lagoon and they'll essentially just put a tarp over the top of it. And then there's a capture pipe that'll come out of that tarp. And as that gas is released from the cesspool, it fills up that tarp. Once it's filled up and it's pressurized, that gas then gets collected and goes for some sort of use.
Small farms can't afford the expensive equipment for these anaerobic digesters, and so there's this perverse incentive to encourage factory farming. Almost half of the profit that a farmer can make off of a cow has to do with the methane they can get from the manure.
We are near Wilder, Idaho, right next to a large beef feedlot that has recently undergone an illegal expansion of their operation to 12,000 head. Turning a large facility like that into a mega facility like that brings a whole host of quality of life issues, pollution issues that these residents just shouldn't have to deal with. If you were to look at it and not quite know what you were looking at, you'd think you were just looking at some sort of dark soil. In fact, you're looking at inches or feet deep of just cow manure that's just accumulating over time. The cows are just wallowing in it. And it smells like what you would expect 140 acres of manure to smell like. And so they really bear almost no resemblance to what folks think of when they hear family farmer or when they think about the imagery on a milk carton.
We live out above the Snake River, and you can see the Wahi Mountains off in the distance that are snow-capped in the wintertime. It's absolutely picturesque and beautiful out here.
Brenda Abbott lives in Wilder, Idaho, next door to a giant feedlot.
There aren't any words bad enough to describe it. You literally can't sit in your own yard. You can't take a breath. I've had neighbors call and talk with me about it. They have sore throats, their eyes hurt, it gives them sick headaches, all the kinds of things that come along with breathing in the kinds of toxic chemicals coming out of the lagoon and from the toxic cattle waste floating in the air, the particulate matter that people are now being forced to breathe.
If you put a dairy digester in place to produce some biogenic methane, you can say, I'm reducing this pollution that would otherwise escape to the atmosphere and increase warming.
Danny Cullen-Ward is a climate economist and senior fellow with the University of Pennsylvania.
Suppose you now get to sell carbon credits from that. Putting money under the guise of controlling pollution encourages concentrated feedlots. Think of another area of environmental pollution control law where we say, it's okay that you're polluting, that's your right. And if we want to change it, we'll make sure we compensate you.
Regulators have decided to create the baseline that factory farms have always existed, they've always been managing their waste this way, and they're always going to manage their waste this way. So in their minds, our choice is either let this industry pollute the climate with abandon, with no regulation, or create these schemes where they capture it and then sell it in these trading programs. Because these facilities are treated as though they're immutable parts of the landscape that will always be here and have always been here, which obviously is not true, they'll get negative 500 carbon values, negative 700 carbon values. And so it's what some programs called avoided methane crediting that creates this system where exceptionally harmful polluting processes get treated as better for the environment and better for people than really what should be the gold standard if we're serious about moving to a decarbonized economy. This entire dynamic makes the economics of small family farming that much more difficult because they now have to compete with a milk producer who's got yet another revenue stream and even more advantage in the market, and it's hard enough already for family farmers to survive in these economic times.
The carbon credits that factory farmers can get for capturing the methane their cows produce are related to the concept of carbon offsets.
The whole idea of carbon offsets is that greenhouse gases are well mixed in the atmosphere and that it doesn't matter where the emissions reductions happen.
Barbara Haya is a senior fellow at the Center for Environmental Public Policy, where she directs the Berkeley Carbon Trading Project.
If it's easier or less expensive to pay someone else to reduce emissions instead of reducing your own, that's the more efficient way of meeting a climate target.
Most of the discussion around climate policy originates with a market-oriented framework. The idea that if you introduce flexibility in where emission reductions occur, you can reduce costs.
There is a certain amount of truth to equating offsets with the so-called indulgences that people purchase from the church.
Basab Sen with the Institute for Policy Studies.
In the sense that it's a way to assure your conscience that you're doing the right thing, that I can do whatever bad things I'm doing because I'm paying someone else to do something good.
For carbon credits to be meaningful at these levels, they need to be additional and durable. Additional means you caused a new outcome that wasn't going to happen without your intervention. And durable means if you're going to count it against carbon emissions, you got to match the durability of CO2's effectively permanent impact on the atmosphere.
In the United States, the project type with the most credits is improved forest management. That project type is generating around half of all credits from projects in the US.
We say that this forest will sequester 1 ton of carbon, which would equal 1 credit.
Thomas Joseph is a Hoopa Valley tribal member and the carbon pricing educator for the Indigenous Environmental Network.
And so you would be able to purchase that 1 ton of sequestered carbon so that your company can turn around and pollute that 1 ton of carbon that you so-called purchased from this forest.
I've been studying carbon offsets for over 20 years now, looking at multiple generations of carbon offset programs and many different project types, and it's not working well. These projects are systematically generating more credits than their true climate benefit.
A lot of forest offsets aren't even necessarily we won't cut this forest, they're more like we won't cut this forest as frequently, we'll let it grow a little bit longer than we would otherwise, or we'll build fewer roads.
Alex Budd is an organizer for the Pacific Northwest Forest Climate Alliance.
And so the premise there is that we'll do some things that we wouldn't do otherwise, and as a result of that, we will emit less carbon dioxide, or the forest will sequester more carbon dioxide than it otherwise would, and they get to sell that as a carbon credit to someone like Shell Oil.
We know how to measure emissions. It's much harder to measure emissions reductions because you have to measure them against a counterfactual scenario of what would have happened had you not bought those credits, had you not supported the project. And that counterfactual scenario is inherently uncertain because it never happened, you can't measure it. And that's where a lot of the overcrediting happens. And many of the projects that have been generating credits are projects that most likely would have gone ahead anyway.
There's no way you can build a market on top of something where nobody involved in that system has a financial incentive in answering the question, what did we actually accomplish, with any accuracy or integrity?
The whole offset market is premised on the idea that the most efficient way to reduce emissions globally is to find the cheapest reductions globally. It's looking for the cheapest reductions on paper, and most of the reductions that we're seeing on the market, unfortunately, are only on paper. What we found with forest offsets in the US is that just looking at one element of the quantification leakage, that most likely 82% of the credits don't represent real emissions reductions. On top of that, most of the credits are generated against fictitious baselines. These projects reduce deforestation, or they increase the carbon on the landscape by reducing timber harvesting, by reducing the clearing for planting palm oil, etc. But if you don't change the demand for timber for palm oil, those commodities are just going to be produced somewhere else, leading to deforestation elsewhere. So that's what leakage is.
California has an offset program that's regulated by the California Air Resources Board. And in a lot of places, the California cap and trade, which includes the offset scheme, is being held up as an example for other states in the US looking to take climate action and regulate climate emissions. In California, research has shown that the forests that were set aside as offsets aren't actually being treated any differently by the logging companies in many cases than the forests that are not offsets. So it's not actually reducing logging. It's not actually reducing any emissions.
Offsets, I think, have been really destructive politically because they motivate and wedge the people in the environmental community who otherwise might have common interests in addressing the climate problem.
We've seen how carbon brokers come into a community and their purpose is to divide us and to break us up so that we're all not on the same page when it comes to climate solutions. When you see industry come in with high dollars to say, if you can get your community to support this initiative, we will give you 10% payout on this contract. If you can get your tribal council to sign on to this, we will guarantee a certain amount of jobs. Not only are these carbon markets dividing tribal communities, but it's also dividing environmental movements where people are thinking that cap and trade is a route to go, that this is something that can be done if done properly. We just need to work out the issues with it. We've been working out those issues for the last 30 years. It is made to fail, and it is made to give a false sense of hope.
To make all the math work on the balance sheets for these companies, governments want to evict indigenous peoples from their lands so that they can sell their lands as a carbon offset.
They go into a forest and they count how much carbon they think will be sequestered by this forest. They'll say, okay, this tree sequesters this much carbon, but they want every bang for their buck. They're going to buy 10,000 acres of forested land for carbon sequestration. They're also going to count how much sequestration does this brush sequester. All of the other vegetation on this land, how much does that sequester beyond just the sequestration of the trees? Now that that's into their calculations, am I able to go on that forested land to gather my traditional foods? Or are those traditional foods being used as a mathematical mechanism that's counted in their sequestration program? Can I gather my teas? Can I gather my basket materials? Am I able to gather material for housing? Those answers are no. You're restricted from that land because that land is now overseen by a corporation that has restricted you from accessing this land, even to the point where you will be removed from these lands because you are affecting the sequestration of the carbon that we purchased.
It kind of gets to this underlying issue, this belief that humans and nature are fundamentally opposed, that the only way humans can be in relationship with nature is either to extract and destroy it or to not be present at all. And indigenous communities around the world have been saying that's not true for a long time, and their existence and cultures point that there's another option there, that we can be reciprocal stewards with the lands where we live, including forests. But that doesn't make it through to the calculations and the model of carbon offset firms.
Rather than working to shut down industries that emit massive amounts of carbon, such as refineries and power plants, industry leaders have another idea called carbon capture and storage.
The idea is that if you use carbon capture and storage, you can burn fossil fuels or you can burn biomass.
Basaf Sen with the Institute for Policy Studies.
You can avoid the greenhouse gas pollution by capturing the carbon dioxide and storing it in the ground.
The oil industry uses carbon capture in oil drilling rigs. So they'll capture carbon dioxide that's coming from an oil extraction area and then inject that back underground in order to force more oil or gas to the surface.
Eric DePlace is an environmental consultant with Sewa Strategies in Seattle.
And the idea is that the carbon dioxide stays underground where the oil was, and the oil comes up and then we can burn that. That's the form of it that kind of works, but it works in a way that isn't really advantageous to decarbonization because we're just getting more oil out of it.
If your intent is to capture a little bit of CO2 to do some enhanced oil recovery with, then fine. But if your intent really is to capture greenhouse gas emissions, wherever it has been tried at scale, it has failed.
What's being talked about now is capturing carbon from power plants, from industrial sites, and generally piping that carbon dioxide to a location where the underground geology will support the storage of large amounts of CO2, and then injecting it into the earth fairly deep down, and then hoping that it stays there long enough to provide us with decarbonization.
There was one big carbon capture project at a coal-fired power plant in Texas called Petronova. It used a lot of federal subsidies. It operated for a few years, over which it captured only 7% of that plant's emissions. And then it shut down because the power plant operator found that it was too expensive to operate and it was too prone to malfunctioning. In Canada, there is a currently operating power plant with carbon capture, the Boundary Dam project in Saskatchewan, the only one of its scale in the world. On average, it captures about 1/3 of the emissions of this facility.
In the Midwest, there are 3 companies trying to propose building up to 2,000 miles of pipelines across 5 states to connect 34 ethanol refineries and add carbon capture equipment to those ethanol refineries and then pipe that CO2 from these ethanol refineries to North Dakota and bury it underground.
Mark Jacobson is a professor of environmental engineering at Stanford University and author of No Miracles Needed.
They want to spend $5.6 billion on the carbon capture equipment and carbon dioxide pipes. What if you spent that same $5.6 billion on building wind farms to power battery electric vehicles instead?
Relying on carbon capture to reduce and eventually eliminate our emissions is a very dangerous pipe dream, because the more we rely on it and the more time and resources we sink into developing carbon capture technology, the more time we lose cutting our emissions, and cutting our emissions is imperative right now. We need to get to about half of our current level of emissions in the next 6 years. Carbon capture is also very energy intensive. It is well known that it has what's called an energy penalty.
You're using up to 30% of the energy of the entire coal plant to capture the carbon dioxide from the coal plant. So you need 30% more coal. Because you need 30% more coal to run the carbon capture equipment, you're producing 30% more air pollution.
Once you've captured the carbon dioxide from an industrial site, you compress it into a pipeline and you pipe it somewhere and then you inject it. You don't really want a carbon pipeline anywhere near you. They're quite explosive.
This is because the stream from carbon capture and storage can sometimes have a little bit of moisture in it, and that moisture reacts with carbon dioxide to form carbonic acid, which then reacts with the metal of your pipe to create fractures.
Carbon dioxide is heavier than air.
Jim Walsh, Food and Water Watch.
And when this rupture happens, that the carbon dioxide actually stays close to the earth and then starts moving, hugging the earth to the lowest point until atmospheric conditions cause that carbon dioxide to dissipate.
Concentrated carbon dioxide is an asphyxiant.
Dr. Bonnie Hamilton is with San Francisco Bay Physicians for Social Responsibility.
If you are exposed to it, it's heavier than air, so it pushes air away, and there have been people who have died or gotten very, very sick from breathing concentrated carbon dioxide. There was a natural leak that happened in Cameroon in 1986. 1,700 people died and 3,500 livestock died. The plume of concentrated carbon dioxide went 16 miles, and there was no way you could stop it.
There have been numerous carbon dioxide pipeline ruptures. The most notorious one was the Denbury Gulf Coast Pipeline's 24-inch Delta pipeline, which ruptured in Sataria, Mississippi in 2020.
People there were over a mile away from the pipeline and were experiencing significant side effects from the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, dozens of people needing to go to the hospital, some with permanent disabilities today because of that rupture. What we also learned is that the vehicles that first responders were driving stopped working because the combustion engines would not burn with that higher level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
CO2 is an odorless gas, so when it leaks, you cannot detect it. You may not even know that there's a leak until it starts to affect you medically, at which point it's already very dangerous.
The use of odorants is an important tool to give early warning to people that there may be a problem. Odorants that we have, because of the unique properties of carbon dioxide, won't stay with the carbon dioxide for a plume once the releases happen, because the odorants themselves would dissipate or potentially interact with the carbon dioxide itself to make the odorant less effective. So where maybe if you were within a quarter mile of the pipeline rupture, the odorant might be helpful to you. If you're further out, you may not smell it.
Carbon capture and storage injection sites are now being promoted in wetlands, and one of the targeted places is the Montezuma wetlands, close to where the Sacramento River enters the San Francisco Bay.
We're in the Montezuma wetlands, the heart
of the Montezuma Carbon Hub Injection Project.
Gary Hughes with Biofuel Watch.
The idea is to capture the carbon dioxide emissions from these major gas-powered electricity generating stations on the south side of the water, all along the delta, and then in a pipeline transport it over here from these facilities, and then the injection site would be here basically in the wetlands.
The Montezuma wetlands is near the Sassoon Marsh, the biggest coastal wetland on the West Coast.
Kathy Carriage lives in Benicia, California, and is with Communities Against Carbon Transport and Injection.
And it's sort of right where the Sacramento Delta ends and where the Carquinez Strait begins, which is what I live on and where there are several oil refineries.
This is actually a place that they've been trying to conserve and have conservation projects in the Delta.
Theo Lacane, Center for Biological Diversity.
The amount of construction that will be necessary, this build out of the pipelines in addition to the injection site, will be very disruptive to ecosystems and local wildlife, as well as many of the people who live nearby. The developer originally, I think, bought the Montezuma wetlands in order to conserve and restore it, and now is using that same land to inject the carbon. I think he would argue that the injection site is far enough away from where the restoration is happening that they're not going to impact each other. But that's clearly based on the idea that you know where these plumes are going to go, and they don't know where the CO2 plumes might end up leaking. And we do know that these pipelines leak.
Where that plume goes depends on topography.
Dr. Bonnie Hamilton, San Francisco Bay Physicians for Social Responsibility.
Like whether there are hills, it depends on the wind and how fast and in what direction. So those factors can't be controlled. Concentrated carbon dioxide is heavier than air and it will flow like water.
If there were a leak from the injection site, the developers themselves have said they don't know how far it would stretch to. It could stretch across the bay all the way to Antioch, which is already a community that is facing all sorts of environmental pollution and environmental injustices.
In Benicia, the pipeline route is very close to a residential area, right next to a children's playground.
Phase 2 would be connecting to power plants and refineries all across the bay in the refinery corridor. These are all communities that have been on the front lines of pollution and extraction. Even if it were to actually capture the carbon it promises to, it is not capturing the other co-pollutants.
It was part of the Inflation Reduction Act, which has some wonderful climate reduction strategies, but this is not one of them. This idea that we should pay industry for its garbage, that is definitely an idea out of the fossil fuel industry.
The Environmental Protection Agency is assessing the project, which means that we do actually have a bit of time to build real community power to resist it, and that's what we are doing very actively right now, is building a coalition, reaching out to community groups, making sure that people understand the threats that this project poses, so that the regulatory agencies can't just get away with saying that, yeah, they slapped the word renewable on it, or it's going to protect our climate, because people know better, and we'll be able to hold them to account.
We will be trying to get local municipalities to pass resolutions saying that they don't favor this. And that is to show that there is a lot of local opposition. It's also to raise awareness about the issue. Most people, they hear carbon capture and storage and they think, oh, wonderful, we're going to be capturing carbon, that's what we need to do. And they don't have any awareness about how ineffective it is, how expensive it will be, and how, with this type of pipeline transportation, how potentially dangerous it could be.
Another climate solution being promoted by the fossil fuel industry and many government leaders is hydrogen.
I often refer to hydrogen as the cousin of carbon capture and storage.
Most hydrogen today, 96% in fact, is produced from fossil gas. That's called gray hydrogen, and blue hydrogen is when you take that fossil gas to produce hydrogen, but you add carbon capture.
The claim that proponents of hydrogen make is, oh yeah, we can attach carbon capture and storage to this chemical reaction, and so we will not emit that CO2 anymore. All it will generate as an end product is water.
The oil and gas industry wants to blend hydrogen into our existing gas infrastructure. The industry says, well, when you burn hydrogen, there's no greenhouse gases released in the atmosphere. And that is true. However, when you create hydrogen, it creates significant greenhouse gases that are worse than coal.
Because blue hydrogen relies on continued extraction of gas, which is principally fracking at this point, it's a great deal for the industry and a pretty rotten deal for anybody who's affected by fracking.
Green hydrogen made from splitting apart water molecules is a cleaner alternative, according to Tyler Lobdell with Food and Water Watch.
Way we need to produce hydrogen, if it's going to be a responsible part of our economy in the future, is through what's called electrolysis from just water and solar panels. And it's almost pollution-free.
Hydrogen is, to a large extent, a solution in search of a problem. Most cases, you don't really need hydrogen as an energy source. You can think of some niche applications like maybe aviation, maybe shipping. But for most stationary applications, why would you use hydrogen? You can point at your nose directly, or you can wrap your arm all the way around your head to point at your nose. You're taking electricity from renewable energy, turning it into hydrogen, and then turning it back into electricity. It's much more effective to store excess energy produced from solar panels or wind turbines in batteries, which are already a much more advanced technology, and again, not completely benign, because if you're talking about lithium-ion batteries, they rely on lithium mining, which is a very ecologically harmful process. But lithium-ion batteries are not the only kind of batteries.
All renewable energy has impacts.
Brenna Bell is the Forest Climate Manager with 350 PDX.
Eastern Oregon right now is being targeted to turn into a huge solar farm, and that will disrupt sage-grouse habitat, that will disrupt a lot of natural ecosystems there, and people are seeing that as a sacrifice zone so that we can continue to use as much energy as we want. If we want to have lives that are much more tied with the fabric of the world, it will mean that we will have to have a major drop in our energy use. A reassessment of what's necessary and what our values are might lead people to living closer in community with each other, to sharing things more, to having lives that are more woven with the place that they're in.
All natural ecosystems and natural healthy soils are carbon sinks. And we cannot be actively getting rid of them with deforestation, with expanding suburban sprawl, with agribusiness taking over more and more land, and at the same time be burning more and more fossil fuels and putting more and more CO2 into the atmosphere, even as we undermine the capacity of ecosystems to absorb that CO2.
Market mechanisms, colonialism, the same very issues that got us in the climate crisis in the first place, we're going to use to get us out of the climate crisis. It's not going to work.
Hooper Valley Tribal member Thomas Joseph.
Seeing how our social ills are directly linked to our environmental ills kind of gives me a little bit of hope, knowing that we can clean up our environmental justice and our social justice will be cleaned up around the same time. As Hoopa people, we always believe that we will always reflect our environment. And when our environment is sick and ill, our people are sick and ill. We still see that to this day. And so with a vibrant, live, and abundant environment, so will our people be. That's what I'm hoping and waiting for. The rebalancing of humanity alongside the rebalancing of our Mother Earth.
It seems like recently, the struggle to take action on climate change has gotten more complicated.
Melanie Ploud, Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility.
And there are a lot of solutions that are presented to us that at first glance look kind of good because they have the words green or renewable in them. But then when you dig into them more deeply, it turns out that not only are they a waste of precious time, but they actually are climate solutions that are worse for the climate. It's like chasing chimeras, a beast from Greek mythology, which sounds fabulous but ends up to be a fanciful illusion.